So again, you are being recorded, so do the right things here, folks. And we're ready to get started. So Mr. Ryan, you're all set.
Okay.
There you are.
All right. We're going to see what that screen looks like, whether you're going to be able to see it. I'm going to say probably most of you at home and not in this room are not able to see it real well, but I'll read it to you. So welcome to all of you who have not seen before. My name is Mr. Ryan. I'm a student at Mount St. Joseph University as a student in social studies teaching, and this is part of my being a student. So the historical question for today is, was the revolution inevitable? Could it have been avoided? And so you guys have studied the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, and you know that at that time, the British colonists and the British regular army fought side by side to defeat the French in North America. And so it seemed like there was pretty good relations between the colonies and the mother country. And yet, just about 10 years later, there was great division and eventually a revolution. So what happened? So the question I ask is, what does it mean to be a Briton in 1750? And the reason I have this picture, which when you all are able to see the slides, you can look at it a little bit more closely. It shows 1689, when William and Mary came to the throne. And it's a picture which shows the prime minister with a paper in his hand, and they are offering them the throne of England, but the deal is that they have to sign a document that says that they are not absolute monarchs, that when Parliament passes a law, that's the law. So Britons believed that the rule of law prevailed in their country, whereas in other countries where there was a king who was an absolute monarch, there was no rule of law. So they felt like they were the freest people in the world. They felt that they were represented in the government through the House of Commons. So they had a three-tiered structure. They did have the king, who had authority, or the queen. And secondly, then they had the House of Lords, who were the peers, the titled people. But thirdly, they had the House of Commons, which was the commoners. And so they felt like they had a voice in government. They had a right to trial by jury. That was not true in other countries. If you did something that upset the monarch in other countries, he could have you beheaded or hanged or whatever without any kind of a trial. Not so in Britain. You couldn't have taxes levied without the consent of the people through Parliament. And you've all, I'm sure, heard taxation without representation was a cry that the British colonists in America had as one of their reasons for choosing to have a revolution. So if you were a Briton in 1750, you were pretty proud that you were one of the freest people in the world. So let's talk about differences between if you were a Briton living on the island of Great Britain or a Briton living in an American colony. So in England itself, which is where the vast majority of the people who lived in Britain, there were people in Scotland and Wales as well, but most people lived in England. The Church of England was predominant. Whereas in the colonies, the Church of England, which was called the Anglican Church, was powerful, yes, but there were a lot of different subsections of Protestantism. Okay, so there were lots of multiple Protestant denominations. If you were in Britain, you either lived in London or you almost certainly had been to London. And if you were in the colonies, you probably had not been to London, and it may have been several generations before anybody in your family had been to London. So you didn't necessarily feel as close to the seat of government as those who lived there. If you were in Britain, could you vote? Only if you had property and you were male. So in Britain, only about 20% of the population of any given area was able to vote, and in many places, much less than that, about 5%. And in the American colonies, about 60% of white males owned land, and so they could vote in their local elections. Taxation without representation. Big issue, right? So when that came up, the British Parliament said, well, of course you're represented in Parliament. We represent all Britons. And that made sense to them because most of the people living right next door to them couldn't directly vote for Parliament, but they felt like they were represented because they had commoners in the House of Commons who, at least theoretically, had their best interests in mind. Just like, I'm guessing, the majority of you, even though you can't vote, you know that you've got senators and representatives, and if you had a complaint, you'd write them a letter and they would respond to you. So you are virtually represented, right? So the idea that the colonists were not represented in the taxes that Parliament was asking them to pay made no sense at all on the other side of the Atlantic. Okay, moving on. English Britons had a very distinct class structure. They had the peers and the titled gentry. They had the merchants and lawyers and physicians who managed to come up with some money but probably didn't own land. They rented a house. Probably couldn't vote because of that, but they were a next class. And then they had laborers on the bottom, and even below them, I guess, would be some serfs who basically lived on the land of the landed gentry and were essentially, quote unquote, taken care of by the lord of the manor. Whereas in the colonies, the landed gentry from Britain did not move to the colonies. Why would they? And the laboring class might have wanted to move, but probably didn't have too much opportunity to. So who was in the Americas at that time was the middling group in general. The second or third son of the landed gentry who was not going to inherit the estate. And so in order to better himself came across the ocean. So the class structure was much less, with the exception of slaves in the American colonies. Among the free population, they were basically all middle class. Now, George Washington was the richest man in the country when he was a relatively young man. And certainly there were some distinctions, but he wasn't Lord Washington, which you would have run into in Britain. And so the Britons, as I already said, because they either lived in London or certainly had been to London, were close to the government, understood a lot of what was going on with the government. The colonial Britons pretty much ignored the government. They did a lot of smuggling, even though technically the rule was that it was a mercantile country, and you guys have heard the term mercantilism, which is where all of the trade from the colony goes through the mother country. And theoretically, you were supposed to only buy your sugar and molasses from the British sugar island colonies in the Caribbean. But there were better molasses in the French and Dutch colonies, and it was very common for those American colonists to buy it from them and just bribe the customs officer to let them bring it in, and then they turned it into rum and et cetera. So the government was often ignored in the colonies. So we have this French and Indian War, and on the two sides of the Atlantic, there are very different views as to what just happened. For one thing, this was a world war. This was not just a war in the Americas. And when the British defeated the French, they got control of India without dispute, which they had been dealing with conflict between them and France as to who was going to be the major power. They got Canada, and they secured parts of the Americas in the Ohio River Valley. So what are they thinking over there? They're thinking, okay, well, we are now a superpower. We are the dominant world power, and we need to regulate this huge empire that we now have. And so we're going to have to crack down on this smuggling stuff and make our mercantilism work. Whereas over on this side of the Atlantic, folks thought to themselves, well, we just made the difference in defeating the French and won this Ohio territory. And we want our spoils of war. War was very expensive, so naturally the British government said, we've got to deal with getting some tax money in order to pay off this war debt. And in the colonies, they said, well, we don't want to be taxed unless we can vote on it. We're used to voting on our taxes. More than half of our white male population has been voting on our taxes for at least a generation, maybe a couple of generations. And nobody from Britain said anything about it. All Britons are virtually represented in Parliament through the House of Commons. I already talked about that a little bit. That's the British view. We don't get to vote who's in Parliament, therefore we're not represented. That's the view from the colonies. So they have these diametrically opposed ideas about what's going on. Okay, from the British government's point of view, over in England, we just fought this war. It was very expensive, and now we've got to take a little time out and consolidate our gains. And India is pretty important, and the Ohio territory we can deal with later. So we don't want to get into any new wars with the Indians, that is the American Indians, not the Indians. And therefore we don't really want our colonists in the Americas to stir up any trouble. On the other hand, from the colonial point of view, hey, we just fought this war to protect our right to this territory, and we want to move into it. What was the point of the war? So the British government, as I say, has to end this idea of salutary neglect, which is a term that you've seen in your APUSH book and in the lectures, etc. And that basically That wasn't the term they used for it at the time. That term actually came from a speech in the House of Commons afterward. But the idea of salutary neglect was that by neglecting to worry about whether there was smuggling going on or not, the British government actually did better because their colonies made more goods, had more income, and so neglect actually paid off for both sides of the Atlantic. But now that we're a major empire, the government says we can't do that anymore. And the colonists say, well, it's been working pretty good for us. You see no reason to stop. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about religion. I've already talked to you guys a couple of times about religion in the Americas. And if you remember, I talked about how in Protestantism, particularly in New England, the idea of predestination was the norm, and if you were among the elect, you lived a godly life and you had a conversion experience, and then the younger generation didn't have a conversion experience because they'd already always grown up being godly, and so you ended up with the halfway covenant, etc. Well, in response to the Enlightenment, which was this idea of the age of reason that happened during this time period, there was a religious revival movement that occurred called the Great Awakening. And it happened both in Britain and in the Americas, but it was much more potent in the Americas because the Church of England was not looking right over their shoulder as it was in England. So what happened with the Great Awakening? You had the new lights. The old lights were the Puritans that I talked about last time I spoke with you all. The new lights began to talk about how you could have a personal conversion and you had the choice as to whether you were going to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And they were very good at putting the fear of God into their listeners. And so you were convinced that might be a good idea for you to go ahead and have that conversion experience and accept Christ. Well, what did that do? It changed the mindset of the people from you're either elect or you're not to I have a choice in whether I'm going to be saved or not. That is a democratizing idea, right? So that happened starting in the 1730s and the 1740s. So this is another big difference between the people on the American side of the Atlantic and the people on the European side of the Atlantic. The people in the American side of the Atlantic have splintered off into all these different groups, the Baptists, the Methodists. Of course, they already had the Quakers and the Puritans who were dissenters from the Church of England. So although they were Protestant, there were lots of different varieties of Protestant. And the second thing is they had this desire then to go out because they decided it was a personal choice. They wanted to convert others, including American Indians and their slaves, which was not so much of a big deal in the other side. So by the time of the French and Indian War, and certainly the 10 years after that, you have a fairly strong Church of England in England. You have a not so strong Church of England in the American colonies. And even in the places where there is a strong Church of England, which would be the Chesapeake Bay and the southern colonies, there was resistance to having the Church of England appoint an American bishop. They said, we really don't need an American bishop. We'll just send stuff over to you guys if we have to have something done with a bishop. All right. So Britain and France have this big battle for supremacy, and I'm going to read to you something here. Patriotism and being a Protestant go hand in hand at this time. So this is from Discourses on Several Public Occasions During the War in America, preached chiefly with a view to the explaining the importance of the Protestant cause in the British colonies and the advancement of religion, patriotism, and military virtue. And it's by a guy named William Smith, D.D., who is the provost of the College and Academy of Philadelphia. It's published in London in 1759. And this is a book that he had published in London that was a reprint of several of his sermons. DD, what does that stand for? See if anybody wants to chat that in who's not in this room. Okay, I don't see anybody raising their hand in the room or in the chat. So DD stands for Doctor of Divinity. So this guy is a preacher and an educated preacher, a Doctor of Divinity. And he was brought to Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin, who wanted him to establish a college. If you remember, Mr. V talked about how what are now the Ivy League schools were generally founded with the idea that we need educated preachers and we're going to teach them how to be preachers in our colleges. Well, this college eventually becomes Penn, which is an Ivy League school. Okay, so I'm going to read to you a little bit about what he said in one of his texts. And this text was written from a sermon that he gave to the British Army during the French and Indian War. And he gave it in Philadelphia. So the people that he's talking to are British regulars and colonists who have joined the army. He says, "Look round you, behold a country vast in extent, merciful in its climate, exuberant in its soil, the seat of plenty, the garden of the Lord. Behold it given to us and our posterity to propagate virtue, to cultivate useful arts, and to spread abroad the pure evangelical religion of Jesus. Behold colonies founded in it, Protestant colonies, free colonies, British colonies. Behold them exulting in their liberty, flourishing in commerce, the arts and sciences planted in them, the gospel preached, and in short, the seeds of happiness and glory firmly rooted and growing up among them." So aren't we great? We're free Britons, we're Protestant, and everything's going great for us. But turning from this prospect for a moment, look to the other hand. Direct your eyes to the westward. There behold popish perfidy, French tyranny, and savage barbarity, leagued in triple combination, advancing to deprive us of those exalted blessings or to circumscribe us in the profession of them and make the land too small for us and the increasing multitude of our prosperity. So we got these French Catholics over here, and they are blocking us from expanding into this territory, which clearly we should be, because we are free Britons and we are multiplying because we're doing things right. And so this idea is that God's on our side is very firm. So he closes in the next, well, actually he doesn't close. If you want to read the whole thing, it's pretty long, but he makes his point again. Upon your success, it depends perhaps whether the pure religion of the gospel streaming uncorrupted from its sacred source, rational, moral, and divine, together with liberty and all its concomitant blessings, shall finally be extended over these American regions, or whether they shall return into bondage of idolatry and darkness of error forever. If we don't win this war, we're not going to have the gospel preached the way it ought to be preached, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So the reason I bring this up is for you to understand a little bit better that the war with France was not just a struggle among nations. It had an aspect of it that was a religious struggle. And in Britain at the time, including the British colonies of the time, the idea that Protestantism is the correct way and Catholicism is slavery because you have to do what the Pope says is very well entrenched. And so that anti-Catholicism is going to show up throughout your study of American history at the time of the Revolution and for more than a century after, even though there were Catholics in the country, you had opposition to Catholicism, and the America was, in the minds of the Protestants in America, a Protestant nation. So that's one issue that we have, Protestantism versus Catholicism. But that's not terribly divisive among the Americans versus the British, except that American Protestantism has splintered into all these little groups that are not too keen on the Church of England telling them how to worship any more than they're keen on the Pope telling them how to worship. So there is some religious division between this side of the Atlantic and that side of the Atlantic. Next thing, the proclamation line, which hopefully you've read about in chapter 7, but if you've forgotten it, basically Parliament and the king signed an order that said you may not move west of the Allegheny Mountains because we don't want to have to get into any more fights with the Indians. We want to consolidate our gains, pay off our war debt, and be done with fighting for a while. Well, that canceled, and those of you who are not in the room can't see this map very well, but when you get a chance, look at this slide, and it shows a current map of Ohio with Lake Erie above it, and it shows a map of the land grant that had been given to the Ohio Company before the French and Indian War. And why did the French and Indian War get started in the first place? What was Washington doing when he went? He was going up to say, wait a minute, you guys, you French are building a fort at what is now Pittsburgh, and we have a claim to this territory. So we're going to say no to that. He started this war. Now, two of the major landholders in the Ohio Company have the last name Washington, his two older brothers. And so when the proclamation line comes along, it has canceled the land grant that these guys thought was going to make them extremely wealthy. And the people in the Ohio Company include a lot of the founding fathers. So they're unhappy with this idea. On this side of the Atlantic, they're saying, wait a minute, the whole point of this war was for us to secure these lands, and now you're telling us we can't move into them. On the other hand, on the British side of the Atlantic, they're saying, you idiots started this war, and it cost us a lot of money, and we're not going to let you make more trouble for us. We got better things to worry about than the Ohio country. All right. So next thing that happens that upsets the colonists, again, taxation without representation. They have the Sugar Act, and I chose an image of a carrot and stick because this was a carrot and stick approach. The British government said, we're going to lower the tax on sugar and molasses so that it's not such a burden for you and you'll be able to go ahead and buy British sugar and molasses from the British colonies in the Caribbean instead of using the Dutch and French that you've been smuggling all this time. And that's the carrot. The stick is that we're going to start enforcing the rule that you actually do have to pay the tax. We're not going to let smuggling continue. And the colonists continued to smuggle anyway because of this idea of we would rather pay more money to smuggle stuff from the French and the Dutch than to pay a tax that Parliament put on us, because we don't think Parliament should be able to put a tax on us. So that's all part of that revolt. All right, so I have kind of laid out a whole bunch of different thorns in the side of the colonists with the British. And I said at the beginning of this that the question was going to be, was war inevitable? Could it have been avoided? So now I'm going to put you in some breakout rooms, and I want you to discuss in your breakout rooms this question. Was there something that could have been done on either side that would have averted the war, or were they already, even though the French and Indian War, they felt very British, they were very proud to be Britons, but their version of what it meant to be a Briton was so different than what it was on the other side of the Atlantic that a war was inevitable. So, for those of you in a classroom, and for those of you at home, just to make it reasonable, please use the chat feature rather than speaking out loud, because if you have different breakout groups in this room and everybody's speaking out loud, it's going to confuse everybody. So I'm going to put you in chat rooms. How many people do we have here total, it looks like?
Yeah, we have 25 including me, so
Okay.
I'll take over at this point. All right, so here's the deal, folks. We are going to put you into breakout rooms. Now, what I would like you to do, and I know it's not possible for all of you, is to actually put your video function on. If you feel like you can talk to each other a little bit, it would be just like, you know, for those of you that are over in Tertia's room or those of you that are in my room right now, it's going to be just like it would be if you were doing small groups in an actual classroom. Try not to all talk at once. Try and talk with inside voices as best you can. What I would ask you to do, and this is your grade, and it's the easiest grade you've had so far, what I want you to do is I want you to actually have one person in the group open up a Google Doc or some, and you can even just handwrite it. It's up to you, because I know, not to call anybody out, but I know how much Anna Baldwin loves to write. Okay, yes, and you're the only one with the video on that's looking directly at me, so I appreciate it. Barbara too, and Matthias. Hey, Matthias, nice to see you. So, needless to say, yes, Cameron, we see you now perfectly. What I want you to do is elect somebody in the group to kind of take notes, if you will, all right? And please, on that Google Doc or on the sheet of paper or whatever, write down the names of everybody that's in your group and just kind of jot down what you talk about. Now, keep in mind, what is Mr. Ryan's major contention here, or what is his question? His overarching question is, was war inevitable between the British and the American colonists? Did the revolution have to occur? Now, he's talking about everything that happened in the French and Indian War, but he's also talking about the differences in mindset. And always remember, there are key components here. We're always looking at the economy. So what economic differences were driving a wedge between the colonists and the mainland? What religious differences were there? What political differences? What societal differences? He talked about, of course, how society was kind of, tiered in different locations. So kind of think about the major overarching concepts of society, politics, economics, religion, possibly even looking at things like warfare, so military, looking at all these different issues and all these different problems, looking at those, was war inevitable? Could they have avoided it? Remember, we're only in 1764 at this point. Keep in mind, the Revolutionary War doesn't start till 1775. So we're still 11 years away. He got you up to 11 years away from what eventually becomes the American Revolution. So again, looking at that, and of course, bringing into account things like the proclamation line. So what I want you to do is talk about those things in your group, jot down some things, and then somebody share that with me. Either send it through email or share the Google Doc with me, whoever's elected to kind of be the secretary of your group. You can certainly ask questions. Mr. Ryan will be monitoring. If you ask questions about, hey, we need something clarified, or hey, we need the proclamation line explained a little bit better, or whatever else, just raise your hand and we'll be into the breakout rooms to help you. But again, we're going to put you into breakout rooms to talk. And we're only going to ask you to do this for about 15 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes tops, okay? And I'm going to put you in rooms of about 4 to 5 people, okay? So again, if you have any questions, raise your hand. Other than that, good luck. And again, jot down as much about what you talk about as you can. And that includes questions too. So we're going to open the rooms.
And is there a way that we can put the slides into Google Docs for them to see right now so that they can?
Yes. So. Yes.
Like this person, their name is, I don't even know what this says. Like RCBA.
So ask them who they are. Just straight up ask. You can also chat, like just type in, hey.
I'm not. Camry. What do we write in the doctors? Do we think the word was?
You're taking
Talk
notes.
about how you decide, how you answer the question. Like just saying yes or no is, if you're going to say yes, why yes? If you're going to say no, they could have done this, what could they have done?
Was it bound to happen? Was there nothing they could do about it? Or was it, hey, if you just did this, we wouldn't have had the problem? I'm sorry. No, there's only one person in the group who's just writing it on all the names. Not necessarily, no.
I'll just say so.
But she does have to make sure that everybody in the group's name is on it.
Yes. Which is the easiest way for me to keep track. I'll send out a message to everybody to. Okay, so at this point, they're all in breakout rooms, and you can monitor whether or not they're participating based upon if they have a green dot next to their name. Now, there's always somebody that has a problem, no matter what. There's always, and my problem right now is Nehemiah, who has had a hard time logging in no matter what. Because he's continually, now I don't know if he's trying to get on his phone or if he's using his computer, if he's using both. I'm not sure. He had issues during AP summer camp, so he I can handle individually because he was at least here during your presentation. So that's not a big deal. But if I want to send out a message to everyone, I just merely get into the chat function and I say the presentation is posted on Google.
That is the question. Yes, sir.
I'm sending out a message. I'm just making sure. Are you all seeing the little message that I just sent out that I just posted the Google presentation? It's in Classroom. Okay.
Can you reference that and be in your chat rooms at the same time?
Share it with everybody in your group.
One person in your group should share it. Mr. V is my understanding, but all of the people in your group's name should be on it so that he knows who is in the group. Mr. Ryan wants to know who RQB is.
Yes.
That way it's not you being weird, it's me being weird.
Oh.
How about this? Here. You're in breakout. Hello, RQV87W. Please identify yourself either in the chat or unmute and let me know who the heck you are.
Why do you sound like
Mr. Tamang, nice to see you. All right. Okay, all you have to do is take notes, and then you just share it with me when you're all done. What are you trying to do?
Share the document.
With me, or
No, with all of the people.
just take notes in the document?
And don't share that.
You don't have. I said it's possible. It's not allowed. Why is it not allowed?
It's very great.
Yes, which means all those who are at home have to do this on their own.
I was about to say, it's only 24 hours. It's not that like-
Okay, while people are out in groups, if you're watching this on a recording because you couldn't attend live, you have to do this assignment on your own. So you're going to have to open up a Google Doc and you're going to have to answer the question that Mr. Ryan posed. You have to answer.
Pardon the interruption. This announcement is that we will be conducting a drill. Again, this is only a drill, but we are going to go into an instructional lockdown. So staff, go ahead and head into an instructional lockdown. We'll be receiving a navigate message here momentarily. Again, instructional lockdown. This is just a drill. Any students who are in the hall need to make your way to a location. Staff need to lock your doors. Thank you.
Okay, so all those at home that are watching this through video, this is what you're missing. You lock down with instruction. So memories. Anyway, you are going to bring up a Google Doc. You're going to answer the question Mr. Ryan posed. This is your grade for this assignment, so do not forget to do that. I'm going to stop recording here in a second of the Zoom call, just so that it isn't 40 solid minutes of you staring at people out in breakout rooms. So again, you are going to be doing that and turning that into me. I will make corrections as necessary.